Okay, good evening. I would like to call this meeting of the Reparations Commission of St. Louis City to order. We can start with the roll.
Okay, we have Reverend Kevin Anthony, Dr. David Cunningham, present.
Present.
Okay,
Present.
William Foster,
Present.
Kimberly Frank,
Present.
Gwen Moore, Kayla Reed,
Present.
Dr. Will Ross,
Present.
and I am Delisha George, present. I'll do one more time, Reverend Kevin Anthony and Gwen Moore. Okay, so those are the only two commissioners who are not present at this time.
Okay. So we have quorum. So today is 8:26, which means we are in the final hour. We are a month out from producing a very historic report for the city of St. Louis. The Reparations Commission findings and recommendations, as you know, stated by Executive Order 75 that was signed in um, winter of 2022 by Mayor Tashara Jones. So we have an agenda, and I actually have um, a slideshow, if I can do this right. Yeah. To just help us guide through some of can you see this?
Yes.
Um, to help us move through some of the discussion. Um, so we have sort of a really packed agenda. It's going to be commission discussion, as we said via email. So we're going to start with some working group updates. We're going to have a discussion really guided by the report working group on two pieces of information that we are hoping um, help us wrap up the written report and guide us to just like final recommendations. Really breaking that into two discussions. One is about the report itself, so some eligibility requirements that the report working group has been both researching and having discussions around. So there's sort of three things we want to talk about under that. And then the recommendation discussion that we will discuss also about 3 to 4 points that we'll focus in on today. And yeah, so my hope is that like I invite everyone on the call to really lean into this conversation because we are now moving really from the sort of written sections to thinking. And last meeting that we met, we discussed having sort of separate from the issue areas that we focus on in the report, sort of an all-encompassing set of recommendations versus having them embedded inside of the issue areas. And so the report working group is really taking lead on ensuring that we get that accomplished, so that we can spend really, the majority of the first half of September finalizing the report, the second half preparing to deliver it to the public. Um, and if there's anything that needs to be added to the agenda, please let me know. But yeah, let's jump in. So as far as working group updates, can we start with the community engagement group?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. So, Kayla, I'm not sure if you received access to our spreadsheet that has a number of testimonials in it from the community to include in the report. And I also had a question around for the community engagement group. What does that, what is the, is there um, some thought around how to engage, if we do it all, the community within the final presentation discussion? So when we do present do we have a space for community there, or is that just us sharing the report findings? Do we want any community involvement at that presentation, or are we just using that for the commission?
Yeah, I think that's open to the general, the whole commission. I think my answer would be at the sort of end of September when we are releasing this report. It's written, its recommendations are complete, and so I think it's more of a, presentation, and people will react, accordingly. But we've held space in each of our meetings, and we'll continue to hold space in the meetings leading up to that sort of finale. And folks are still encouraged to submit, especially after today's discussion, any written testimony that they can send via email to the reparations email that's on the city website. But yeah, I think once the report is sort of finalized, it's finalized.
Okay. I guess I'm trying to and I'm sure that's still something we're figuring out what to do with the initial or additional engagement that does come. How do we respond
So I
to
think I'm
what?
trying to understand what you're saying. Well, we certainly have responses from the discussions earlier that Rosa Parks incorporated into a document. We'll have to share that. And so a lot of those comments are already there. Yes, we will receive additional comments, and those will certainly be further incorporated into the discussions that Rosa Parks provided. It's just be an expansion of that. I don't think we need to have anything separate. I think they should all be one uh, one actual this topic area of community responses.
So we would just direct them somewhere else, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, at the point that the
Redirect.
report is, yeah, at the point that the report, our sort of duty as the commission sunsets at the point of the release of the report. And so I think we can work with, Jonathan and Vernon and other members of the administration to create sort of a landing in what happens next. But really the work of the commission is to produce the report. And once that's produced inside of the extension, um, our roles, our term has ended in our roles.
Okay. Our communication has ended. Okay.
Great. Anything else from the community engagement group? And then no, I don't have that spreadsheet, so if we could get that ASAP, it could be
Okay.
shared with all three of us. That would be great. The
Okay.
report.
Yeah, I didn't include all three. I thought for sure I'd shared it with you, but I'll share it again.
Okay. Awesome. So the report working group has quite a few updates. Um, we now have drafts of all the sections of the issue areas. And as folks can recall, the sort of report outline that we've been guiding really defines reparations. There's sort of the opening letter from the commission explaining Executive Order 75, a land acknowledgement. We're going to spend some time in the report sort of defining reparations and discussing, by virtue of this conversation, really the parameters that we're sitting inside of as we think through reparations, and also some of the inherent tensions that have come up from both the public and the commission members around reparations, like the scale and scope of it, the relationship it has to a state based conversation on reparations and the national movement for reparations and how we really see ourselves fitting inside of that lineage of work. And so we're working through that section. David and I, there is a section, as Dr. Ross mentioned, work of the commission that was anchored by a choral fellow who was with the city of St. Louis. Her name was Rosa, that really sort of is shaping the community engagement portion, talks about the meetings we've had, how many people we've engaged, et cetera. And so we're editing that in real time. The next section of the report is enslavement in St. Louis. And I'm reading from a document that you all have access to, the Reparations Commission report outline. And so the enslavement in St. Louis section has been anchored by some of the contributors we mentioned in previous meetings. And after that, we go into the issue areas, which we've decided we've combined housing and neighborhoods into one section. Education is the second section, public health, jobs in the economy, and state violence. Each of those sections really think about the history of that specific issue. We want to include some personal narratives and testimony, so we'll be taking that from the spreadsheet that the community engagement group brought over. And then thinking through some sources for further learning, which we may end up just concluding the entire report versus doing that inside of each issue area. And then the last sort of section, as denoted in our previous meeting, is the recommendations. And so thinking of culminating this conversation on reparations through telling the history of enslavement in St. Louis, and then the larger ways in which race-based harm have happened across time and issue, we want to land in some recommendations for the city of St. Louis to take up and hopefully implement. And so those sections are in progress. Dr. Ross spent the majority of his Sunday compiling the different sections into one single document for the first time, and doing some editing and remarking. And Dr. Cunningham and I are going to assist in working through that because it'll need to go through several rounds of edits, things that we're going to add, context that's missing to make sure that it's threaded and arcs well on the narrative front, and really delivers what the material in the spirit that the commission has hoped to do for the past year and a half. And so yeah, so that is just an update on what the report working group is. I'll ask if Dr. Ross or Dr. Cunningham have anything to add.
I would just add, Kayla, that we had the discussion of including the history of reparations commissions across the country. And so I just did a really brief review of that and incorporated that into the part that the Cora fellow, Rosa Parks, had drafted. It's only about a little over a paragraph, and that may need to be embellished. I don't think we need to go into too much detail, so I'll allow everyone to read that part. In the report that I condensed, not condensed, but I collapse everything. It's going to be highlighted in red.
Yeah.
The part about prior reparations commission activities.
Awesome.
Otherwise, I think it's as you just stated.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ross. David, anything you want to add to that as an update?
I don't think so. I appreciate you going so thoroughly through each piece. No, I think we're great to move through.
Awesome. Any questions from the members of the commission to the report working group before we get into the discussion?
No.
Awesome. Okay, so I've tried to take so so we're gonna have two conversations, maybe six conversations really, but I'm bucketing them into two areas. One is specifically about the report, and something that we have really been hearing from the public and sort of teasing out on these calls, but really need to land the plane on, is around eligibility. Who is like, how will reparations like interface with the general public, knowing specific histories are true in St. Louis, around residency, lineage. And then we also had a question around specific sort of egregious harms that are sort of site-based. And Dr. Ross and David, if I'm not explaining this right, please chime in. Then the second discussion is really about the recommendations themselves. So we are going to spend some time making a decision around direct cash payments and how to do that. And then other forms of non-cash recommendations that really are sort of defined out of in Cobra and other ways that people have defined reparations, and then thinking through like policies and programs as redress to ensure that these harms that we've identified in the report don't continue. So to do that, I've sort of thought about just a couple questions that are guiding questions. I'm going to take notes, do my best to take notes in the discussion. But really the sort of first conversation we want to have around eligibility is how should the report navigate residency? And the sort of examples I wrote in that are families who no longer live in the St. Louis region. So someone who maybe lived in St. Louis in the 70s and now they live in Harlem, or they're an expat and they're in Costa Rica. How do we navigate that, right? But their family and history is in St. Louis. And then the second is families that are still in the St. Louis region, but not proper in St. Louis City, knowing fragmentation is arguably one of the race-based harms that have happened to Black people in our region, and the ways in which tax base and resources have been divided across city and county. But for families like mine who migrated from the South to St. Louis, lived in St. Louis City for decades, and now maybe live in North County or West County or St. Charles County. How are we navigating those realities? So want to pose those questions to the commission and hear thoughts.
Yes,
Wait, hey, I,
I had some
uh,
thoughts earlier. There's a echo there.
No, that's Jonathan, I think, from on trying to get in, but he's in the car. So
Okay.
go ahead, Jonathan, and then Dr. Ross, you can go.
well, one of the questions that I was going to pose also is that have we kind of set a timestamp or a time frame of the actual harm? You're right. I'm sorry. Of the actual harm, because as like you say, families who've migrated to and from the city, would their family have been effective by the harm, or did they just move into the after effects of it? If that makes sense. Like how you said your family's been here for, 4 decades. I think, like somebody, like I'll take me for example. My mom was born in Mississippi and then moved up here. So did she was she truly affected by the harm, or move into the aftermath? And somebody who moved into the aftermath, do they qualify also? That's just my question I'm posing.
Okay, additional questions being posed to the commission. Go ahead, Dr. Ross, on your answers.
I was going to state, earlier I was looking really at the harm of individuals who have a connection in St. Louis City, since that was the actual target of the Reparations Commission. I clearly, like most of us now, recognize that that has to be extended, and that we do have to have a way of acknowledging those who are those families that you actually have outlined. And so we simply have to have some way to have an individual document that who's the extended family, what were their times in St. Louis. We have to have some way of getting that information and documenting that and actually having that information somehow, verified, validated, and allow us to proceed with this kind of broader residency rule that I think I now support.
Thank you, Dr. Ross.
I believe that in terms of timeline, we have to look at when the city became into existence as an entity, right? So then there's that timeline. But then we break it down by looking at what specific race-based harms are we identifying, right? And so then if you identify the harms, then you create the nexus of who was touched by those harms based upon those. So if we're looking at housing, education, employment, right? I think if you look, you start with those as identifiable harms, it's going to be broader than just dropping in and saying, okay, well, somebody moved to St. Louis and their family didn't move here until 1979. Therefore, they're not entitled to any reparations because I think that fundamentally what we're looking at is the way in which systemic harms were created. So if we are doing systems-based thinking, right, then we have to acknowledge that it's just not so, I know some people are of their mind that it has to be, you've got the ADOS philosophy, whereas you're specifically a descendant of a slave. And you have to be that. You have to prove that you are a descendant of an American slave in order to be entitled to reparations. But then there's Jim Crow and people who came into St. Louis and they were Black. And because of their Blackness, they experience very specific harms at the hands of the government.
The lineage conversation is the next question.
Yeah.
I want, hold us into the residency requirement piece. And I think, my answer to, my answer to the question I think that Jonathan posed was just like the executive order sort of lays out that the time period we are talking about is from the period of enslavement through the manifestations of race-based harms that are currently in existence. And so I don't think there's a year cutoff, right? Because to argue a year, like for example, 1979, to say that the families that lived in St. Louis through the 80s and 90s also experienced a specific type of divestment, also experienced the consequences of, or the generation that experienced the consequences of the policies that we're thinking through and the plans that were instituted in the city of St. Louis. And so I don't, I don't think that there is a particular like 1920 to 1970 window that we can create to sort of book in the conversation. But I think we have to think beyond that. And then, and in some cases, just to name, some folks have said, if you don't have, like, if you have not lived in the city of St. Louis for, the last 20 years or the last decade, or if you have no current presence in the city of St. Louis, then you wouldn't be eligible for reparations underneath this. And if we're saying, actually, if you can prove residency in St. Louis at any time and then you would be eligible for this. I think we have to like talk through those as sort of the spectrum options. Are we disqualifying people who are not in St. Louis currently or at a certain point? Or are we including folks who have any and all Black folks who have been in St. Louis?
I think we have to, you made a point of like, we cannot disregard the impact of fragmentation, right? There are people who have been displaced. So like I was really kind of struggling with the very place-based solutions. Someone submitted an article to us and was really strongly emphasizing place-based solutions vis-a-vis invest in North City. But I'm just like, what about the bodies? St. Louis keeps on using place in building space solutions to solve problems while ignoring the human bodies that are impacted. So I think we have to follow the humans and not the places. If we're talking about true, like who are the victims? The victims are not necessarily buildings. It just communities were disrupted, and there's place-based outcomes of that, but there are humans that I think are supposed to be restored along this line, whether they live here or not. If they have been impacted by this very specific harms that we're identifying, then I believe that they should be entitled to reparations.
Well, I think that we're answering the first question through this discussion about navigating the residency. I think we're now stating that we have to respect the broad diaspora, Black people through this time period, not time period, but through the time that that was identified in the initial request or the initial comment from the letter from the mayor, the charge, and that we have to find a way of documenting the residency. So anyone who has that identification from St. Louis from an extended period of time, they have to simply provide some proof. I mean, that can be done. It will require validation, but I think that we're all saying broadly, we would extend the requirements broadly. Anyone who has had historically connection to the St. Louis region over time would be eligible.
Got it. So just as like a proposal to take back to the to us, the report working group, that are we in alignment? Because I want to make sure we make space for you, William, Delisha, David, obviously the members who are not here. We will also communicate with them to get their thoughts on this, but it seems like we're landing sort of in a proposal that there's a broader based application of eligibility with regards to residency, inclusive of Black folks who no longer live in St. Louis, provided proof of residency can be established.
I agree with that. I guess my only question is, as far as like, the timelines, like, it seems like we're trying to agree that it's going to be very broad as long like we're not setting a timeline. Like, if you live from this period to here or like present day, I'm thinking like, I'm just going off of like the testimonies that I've read. Most of the effects or like the harm-based issues have been identified around like 1950. So like the testimonies were about Homer G. Phillips, the closing of that, and how they um didn't have access to like health, so that became an issue. That was closed in 1955. And like Miller Creek, did I say it wrong? Sorry.
Mill Creek.
Creek Valley.
Booker Valley, that closed. I mean, that happened around like 1959. And so like the only things that have been identified have been around that period. And so I think maybe the timeline should just be around from, I guess, 1950 to going forward. I don't know if anything else has been identified or if there's any other issues that were discovered in like the research, but that's just what I'm getting from based off of what I've heard from those testimonies. And maybe I just need to read through all the reports, but yeah, I guess open to any thoughts on that.
Um, I I'm also I'm hearing all of the feedback, and so I am taking that in, but I'm also kind of looking at a certain timeline of 50s as well, thinking about Mill Creek, thinking about Laclede Town, 50s, 60s. Like I'm trying to, what I've been kind of stuck on are those communities that were completely demolished. And for those, you've heard so many stories where families were say we were doing good, we had, we had this, that, and the other in our neighborhoods, and then they came. So in thinking about like the urban renewal, knocked so many communities out, and that seemed to be the beginning of the end for a lot of them. And so I am kind of, my thought has been around those families that were affected by that and their children and grandchildren. What has that looked like? Um, I'm kind, so I'm hearing all of the feedback and really taking that in as well, but I'm too stuck around like the 50s and the 60s, especially because it seemed like we all know St. Louis has a rough history. And then there seemed to be a time where families were doing better, but then once all those buildings that, Commissioner Franks was talking about, all those things start to pop up because homes were knocked down, communities were knocked out for that. So I'm just kind of stuck on that point, on those families in particular.
Yeah,
So,
and one of the questions that, we have posed here is, should there be specific restitutions for specific sites, right? And my uh I'm trying to balance my opinion and my role as facilitator, which is hard sometimes, but the I just want to ground us that the executive order says, centuries of American slavery, segregation, racism, racial capitalism, and injustice have reinforced the racial hierarchy that remains in place to this day. And so thinking through, the ways in which the like we are required to think about, because I do think, by virtue of how information is spread, yes, there is an egregious there are egregious examples of removal, and in St. Louis, and like we've seen with Mill Creek Valley and Laclede Town. Also, you know, I am the child of someone who grew up on a street called DeSoto in North City in College Hill. And that neighborhood didn't have the same blighted plan that took place in Mill Creek Valley, but the removal rates are astronomically similar in how populated it once was till now because of some of the same decisions around investment. So I
mhm.
think we can hold both, that there might need to be, and the report working group is asking specifically, should there be specific restitutions for specific sites? And also, um, this timeline question, I can't say one decade was better for Black people than the next, or one was worse than the next, especially thinking about, the Nadir period for Black people in the 1910s and the 1920s. Obviously, migration increased exponentially in the 40s, 50s, and 60s from places in the South to St. Louis. So there were more Black people here at that time than in previous decades. St. Louis population peaked almost at 1 million folks in the 60s and 70s, and we've seen a sharp decline since then. And so I hear the relationship to that sort of reverse, curve, and also don't want to minimize or not include the parts from the 1800s to the current manifestation too, because I think we'll miss a lot of people focusing in on just a couple decades.
So we've moved from one question to the third question about navigating residency to specific restitutions. So
Yeah, I think the reason we got there, Dr. Ross, though, was because William was naming almost like a question around how we navigate folks who were impacted by these things and maybe are no longer living, to folks who are not directly impacted by these moments, but are the descendants of those. And so I think we were still in a residency conversation. It
And
expanded out.
yeah, so
I want to speak to, some of, kind of differentiating what we saw in the 1950s versus like 1970s and later, right? And whether we did in fact receive information, because historically there was a shift from like more overt racism. So that's kind of like when you hear about the new Jim Crow, right? That's kind of the conversation where things started to be embedded and the strategies changed. So things weren't so overt. So like Team 4, we talked about not Team 4, but we talked about the Team 4 plan, and it was kind of like a informal approach to development in the city. That the foundation for that was laid in the 1970s. So they weren't saying, we're gonna like tear down all the homes for the where the Black people live, but the way that was outlined in the division of investment versus disinvestment had a disproportionate impact upon Black bodies, the places where Black people live. So that's why it's kind of tricky to say, oh, well, after the 1950s, it wasn't so overt and there was nothing, there was nothing there. It continued to go on. It's just that the strategy and the conversations and how it was packaged changed. So
Well,
I would say, let me make a point right quickly, Jonathan. I think that when we're looking at specific sites, I think it's important to identify the ones we mentioned, Pruitt-Igoe, Mill Creek, the others that have been mentioned. But I think that we have to recognize that these things have transpired over a century. And that century does go back to 1900, 1904, as Kayla mentioned. It goes back to the East St. Louis race riot, which spilled over to St. Louis. And there are still members who actually were descendants of that group. So I think we have to be cautious about highlighting a particular time period which is more contemporary. I mean, if we're going to have a time period, it really should go back at least the entire century, or the entire 20th century, and really should focus on both, the extending those who we agreed upon who are residents. We can have the discussion about lineage in a few minutes, but I think that we would have a lot more impact if we then focus on those specific sites where we actually have documentation, historical documentation of direct concrete harm, and that includes those areas that are mentioned.
Yeah. So it feels like we've answered the third question. I just want to take us back to the proposal on residency to make sure we agree on this so that the working group can figure out how to tease this out, is that we are applying sort of, again, a broad-based application of eligibility regarding residency, which can include Black folks who no longer live in St. Louis City proper, provided proof of residency can be established. Is anybody strongly opposed to that?
I know I don't have a vote or a true say so. I think my only caveat to really think about is depending on what the true recommendations are, and just thinking like down the lineage, down the line in future. Oh, thank you, Puda. Just thinking down the line, if we were we don't want to, we want to be cautious of having the solution cause future harm for the city as well. Meaning that we allocate a lot of finances and resources to people who no longer are truly invested in the city. So therefore, we can use this time to actually truly grow, build, and have the city prosper. So that'd be the only thing that I would just ask the commission to keep in mind when
I
thinking, about people outside the city, state, or region. Um,
so I hear that, and also um I say this with all the love in the world. I don't think that's the responsibility of the commission is to figure out the how. The responsibility of commission is to figure out the what and why. And I think for folks who work at the city, like you, there is a secondary conversation about, but I don't think we should confine ourselves to, because we don't know what resources are going to become available for this conversation at all. And based on what the city has said, pots of resources that have been available are not necessarily going to be earmarked for this. So I think the implementation, like, I don't think we should charge the commission with that. And so I just, because I don't think we should be.
I'm in agreement with Kayla, 100%.
that's fair.
Yeah, I agree too. I mean, it's kind of a conflict of interest. Like we're speaking to what the harm was for so our position is to make recommendations in favor of the victims. So, mhm.
Right. So
And
if they're, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and there are people that would love to still be here, but they were displaced. So,
Yeah. Okay, so I'm skipping question 2. We're going to go back to it, but I'm going to go to question 3 because it came up. It feels as though we are saying as a proposal, there should be specific restitutions for specific sites, as mentioned by William, Kimberly, and Dr. Ross, places like Mill Creek Valley, the people impacted by the removal of institutions like Homer G. Phillips, and so we are noting that there should be specific restitutions for those sites. Are we in agreement on that, or anyone strongly opposed to that proposal?
Not opposed, but I have to keep interjecting thoughts and please continue to push back. But also we start thinking about individual instances. Is the commission taking consideration what was a local initiative versus a federal initiative?
No, that's not what the executive order calls for. It says race-based harms that happen in St. Louis. And so we can't, like, to but also, so it's a both and. We also state in our report that the totality of the harm that was done, redress can not only be provided by the St. Louis city government. And so there has to be a continuation of the conversation on reparations on a state level and a federal level in order to, equitably respond to harm that has happened. But if that answers your question. So it's like a yes and no.
mhm.
It did. Thank you.
I'm in agreement with this approach as well, the blanket approach, but also this more targeted approach for sites like this. A couple of questions, just maybe clarifying for myself, and then making sure we're all on the same page. Is when we say that people who can prove residency in St. Louis at some point in the past, are we referring to the individuals making the claims themselves would have lived here? I'm wondering about somebody whose grandparents were in St. Louis, they were displaced, they moved somewhere else, and now they're coming back and saying that their family intergenerationally have been harmed. Would that be outside of our scope if it's thinking back generations, or are we going to recognize that?
So the question is if sorry, I have to make it like all the way personal. So like if my grandmother lived in St. Louis,
Yep.
but I was born outside of St. Louis, could I make a claim to reparations in St. Louis?
Yes. And we could extend this too to say Mill Creek. Are we talking with individuals about individuals who are still living who lived in Mill Creek, or are we saying the descendants of those residents can have a targeted claim?
A great question.
It's a good question, and I think that since we're looking at communities that have been displaced, I think it's important that we identify as many people who are in those communities, irrespective of how long they've been removed from those communities. So those communities, Mill Creek, Pruitt-Igoe, and others, were harmed, and we should, and those individuals who no longer have that connections person because they relocated still and they are still due some compensation.
Kind of think I think I fall on the other side of the line. Do I fall on the other side of the line? This is a good question to ask. That's going to be recorded and on the history books forever, David. But I think, yeah, I actually need to think about it some more. I'll let someone else go.
The harm is multi-generational. We don't have intergenerational wealth because of housing displacement, right? So that's where the inequity comes because of what would happen to ancestors, right? The descendants are still struggling. So I guess this is where kind of just the way I look at things philosophically as a lawyer comes in. Equity is equity. You have an estate, your estate has been harmed, you're a descendant of the state, then you sue and you're entitled to. So just as much as you would be able to go back and sue for the loss of an estate, I think that reparations, if we're going to really, really just talk about the impact of it, and be just truly sincere, then it ought to be honored as something that is intergenerational.
I agree with that also.
David, can I ask a question? Since you know the California report better than me, how did like California navigate that question?
It's a good question. I've been trying to look back at this. It's not exactly clear, at least from the notes that I took here. To me, it looks like an individual has to prove residency themselves. And so it's not, they can't make a claim based on where that their grandparents had lived in California or their great grandparents. I agree philosophically with Kimberly's point about the intergenerational nature of all of this. I think in California, it had to be the individual making the claim. The other thing that comes up there that's related to this, it might be sort of a follow-up question, is they also scaled the degree of redress based on time of residence. So someone who had lived there for decades and had moved away was eligible for more in terms of direct cash payments than someone who had been there for their minimum amount of time was 6 months. But then from there, it was scaled based on time of residence. So I don't know if we want to adopt something like that, so we have scaled payments, or if we want it to be blanket.
I like the concept of scaling this and having some proportionality in this. Proportional increase in someone who's had an extended time and experience extensive harm. So I do think they should be scaled. And I agree with Kimberly about intergenerational harm, but I also agree that it has to be documented in that individual. That individual has to have a case. It just simply can't be extended without some documentation of when they lived and where they lived. We need to have that documented.
Yeah. The program includes direct descendants of those who are impacted by their time,
No matter where they live.
no matter where they live.
So their housing benefits extend to people whose housing is in another state? It like you don't have to use the housing benefit in Evanston there?
I'm not sure. I just know that you can that's not the side of it that I'm looking at. The fact is that you can be a claimant if you can lay a claim to their program based upon descendancy. Now, whether or not however they implement it is beneficial to that person, but it's that you have standing if you are a direct descendant. That's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, my question would be around that. I mean, around the question of like site versus lineage, like, descendants, is if we were, and one of the questions we're going to ask in the recommendations, and I know we're toggling back and forth now, is about sort of the scaled process, right? So if I am because someone can experience multiple harms, right, across different areas, and so you can deal with a type of state violence by virtue of living in targeted neighborhoods that dealt with increased police brutality, and neighborhoods that had low wealth building possibilities because of local proposals. I I am wondering if this scaled based on time of residence, wouldn't that cover some of the specific restitutions for sites, since folks who lived in the city longer would have the type of redress, an increased type of redress than those who didn't, if that makes sense.
I'm not
Like,
fully following.
are we like, are we sort of, I'm trying to think about a person, the best way I could do this is an example. A person who lived in Mill Creek Valley and also lived in the city for 40, left Mill Creek Valley, but moved to the Peabodys, for example. Would they would have both claim for the time that they lived in St. Louis, say over the span of 40 years, and then a specific claim because they were a Mill Creek Valley
Mhm.
resident.
Mhm. Yep, they'd be able to kind of stack their claim.
Right, I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Can I just want to add to the question of the California reparations residency requirement. They do have to, they would have had, first of all, they're lineage based. So they do have to be descendants of people enslaved within the US, but the residency was at least 6 months in California. And that's not, they haven't made that part of the policy. They're still working on that, but that is what they are going off of, lineage based in at least 6 months. And for Evanston, you do have to be a resident living in Evanston to receive that benefit. So you can't live outside of Evanston to get that housing benefit.
Right. I acknowledge that. It's just that in order to make a claim, you don't have to have lived there. Like you could be like, oh, yeah, I'm in Columbus, Ohio. I'm gonna go make a claim and come to Evanston and take advantage of it.
Yeah. So I hear general yes, specific restitutions for sites such as like Mill Creek Valley, etc., McCreetown, Laclede etc. That is a great transition to Lishay, because the third question on this page is about lineage. And there are sort of two schools of thought around lineage. One is that um, recommendations or reparations themselves, as offered by the city, should be reserved for those who are direct descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. That is one school of thought. The second school of thought is that Black people writ large who lived in the United States during periods of harm are eligible, regardless of if they are descendants of enslaved Africans or not. A sort of material example is a place like, New York. There are people who live in New York who are the grandchildren of folks in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. There are also Black folks who migrated from the Caribbean New York. Both of those populations lived in New York in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s. The question is, should only those who are the descendants of those from the South who were enslaved be eligible for reparations, or should all Black folks who lived in a place during periods of harm be eligible for redress? I pose that to the commission.
Well, uh, Dorothy actually addressed this in his book, and they weighed in on being almost a purist. This is really for individuals, Black individuals who suffered harm in the U.S., not those who were migrants who didn't have that historical connection to slavery, direct connection. So that's I mean, that's a kind of a purist approach, which I actually do espouse. I do believe that. So I'm going to go with Dorothy on this one.
I would say I felt yesterday or a couple of days ago when we met in our group, I was feeling similarly, Dr. Ross. And one thing I'm noting though, because Darity is advocating for a national process that's specifically around reparations for the legacies of enslavement. And I'm just noting that the executive order that we're working under is broader than that. It says enslavement, segregation, and other race-based harms. So I feel like we have a bit of a different charge than the one that Darity is defining, which makes me lean in the other direction and being more expansive about the population that's encompassed by that. So I'm just trying to think about our alignment with what the charge is and what the implications of that are for who falls under that.
Yeah, I see your point, David.
Any others?
So I, if we are saying that race-based harms continued and persisted beyond legalized slavery, why limit reparations to those of us who are direct descendants of enslaved Africans? If it truly, truly did happen and there's still the harm just is shifted and what's going on, why?
Yeah, so you feel like you're more aligned with the sort of diasporic definition, expanding beyond the
Yeah, Malcolm X fought really hard for us, and he was descendant of a Jamaican immigrant. You read his whole autobiography. That's why. So
yeah, okay. I'm just taking note of where people are falling. So that
I'm with the descendants of enslaved, um, of those that were enslaved.
okay.
so why not, like, we were talking about like stacking the damages.
Yep.
So that's why I'm just like I'm like that. That's like a sincere question. If somebody could just say, "What?" I just sincerely want to know why limit it to just the descendants. If anyone can speak to it.
I am not a proponent of it. In part because again, and I think, depending on where you are in this country, that conversation is a lot larger, louder, and more nuanced. Like I use the example of New York because New York is one of the, greater populations of non lineage Black folks who have endured for a century as well. When we think about the 1920s, the type of racialized harm, and the descendants of those folks present and accounted for in today's time. I think the argument around reparations, and this is one of the things that is super nuanced, right? Is because if 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 reparations is confined to redress for enslavement, then yes, a lineage-based requirement is necessary. Someone who is not, if we were only to talk about enslavement as the cause of harm and enslave and we're redressing only that, then yes, I think that requires an establishment of your lineage. I think this report is more expansive than that. And also I think because it is a local report, um, most of the folks who live in St. Louis and are the descendants of enslaved Africans, those folks, most of us are not, our ancestors were not enslaved in St. Louis. And so I think to then confine it to the descendants of enslavement, because it's a local reparations force, I think excludes a lot of people who have been impacted by the policy, and then opens up a real question for me of like, um, how the local reparations should be in conversation with the national movement for reparations specifically, but doesn't replace it at all.
So yeah, we've been warned, shouldn't replace it. If you remember, that was Darity's major warning, that local efforts are not akin to major reparations claims. So this is, so, but that's just like an aside.
Yeah, no, agreed.
Yes, I think that there's a powerful argument that has just been made, which is kind of changing my mind a bit, about those who have had extensive time in this country. And sometimes we have to talk about a time frame, extensive time in this country, even though there may not have been direct descendants. Their extensive time have exposed them to harms, um, generational harms. And so I think that, it's kind of hard to discount that statement. So I'm changing my mind in mid discussion here.
Well, that's the whole point of a debate, Dr. Ross. Maybe
Appreciate that. Yeah.
maybe folks to be moved. But also I appreciate that reflection, and it's something I've been thinking about for a really long time. And again, and maybe we need to tease this out, mostly talking to David in the piece where we're talking about defining reparations, that this needs to be articulated as a why, right? Like in some instances, there is a large demand and movement to create just a type of reparations that is lineage based. And in our thinking and reasoning, this is the other piece. Now, obviously, I'm just taking votes because I do know that this is like a really big defining question of the report. So if folks are like, I need to sit on it, and we also need to ask Reverend Anthony and Ms. Gwen, but want to tease out to the rest of the commission what David, Dr. Ross, and I have been debating through and figuring out for months now. And so yeah, we have currently 4 votes for sort of the diasporic definition. 3 votes are still out. 1 vote is for direct lineage.
So I want to throw out an example. So, we have a conversation about killing Black bodies. People say the conversation is stop killing Black bodies, not stop killing bodies are who are descendants of enslaved Africans, because there is the side of how do we put the cog in the system to make it stop so that it is not allowed. Like the thing that it functions off of, the poison is race-based oppression, right? And so that, that's what the whole thing about the 13th as the book was about. It talked about how, we had this one thing happen, but it really didn't. We have a new era of slavery that's happening, and it's not it's not looking at whether or not your ancestor was enslaved. It's identifying what you look like. And the oppression happens based upon that. So some of this is about being an interrupter, disrupting the system of oppression, while also bringing restoration to the victims. So I could see where, what Kayla was talking about, she was asking her questions like, well, what if you lived in Pruitt-Igoe and then you lived over in this neighborhood and this happened to you? I just think that that descendants of enslaved Africans would be entitled to more reparations.
Yeah, that's a consideration we can hold. William, I think you were about to say something.
Yeah, I enter my vote in favor of expanding the definition. I think just reading the executive order, it's not just slavery, it's segregation and race-based harms. So that's my vote.
And I do want to say, I have no idea, I have no idea how many people we are talking about. I keep using the New York example because I think New York is such a profound landing, it has such a large demographic of folks who are inside of this category. But so I don't know how many folks are of diasporic descent, non enslaved in the US context. I don't know how many people that is in St. Louis, how many people will lay claim to it. But I certainly think that the recommendation, the report sort of requires us to have a nuanced understanding of how race-based harms manifest. And I think to Kim's point, no one's saying if you're not the descendant of an enslaved African, I won't lock you up in the workhouse. And that's just a reality. Still need to ask Miss Gwen, still need to ask Reverend Anthony, but that is 5 for diasporic definition, which is the majority, but still want to hear and take note on people's position on this, because I do just want to honor and hold. It is an incredibly important discussion to have and to wrestle through, and the relationship to a local reparations movement, or sort of a commission like ours that is local, is different than a state like California, and it's different than a national conversation on reparations. Okay, so it's 7:13. Delisha, can you remind me if we're here to 7:30 or 8?
We are scheduled to 7:30.
Okay, so we have 17 minutes. All right. So I think for the most part, David, we are we've shaped some of this. David wrote out a really great one thing that has felt apparent, and also we want to test, right, is direct cash payments. And I think we've been talking a lot about dispersal of resources like a direct cash payment.
Kayla, I'm sorry to interrupt. This particular meeting is actually scheduled till 8.
Okay.
We are on the calendar till 8 for this one. Sorry.
Okay, so take back your 17 minutes, breathe. 47 minutes or 37 minutes. So we are going to have a conversation now about some recommendations. So there are 3 things I want to seed in this. One is we need to sort of explicitly vote if we are in agreement that one of the recommendations is direct cash payments. And if we are in agreement to that, David has the working group actually has sort of thought through a proposal around how to articulate that. The second piece is like beyond direct cash payments, there is a sort of non-payment recommendations and falling into specific categories like policies, programs, memorialization, other things that capture both the history and our preventative measures for recurrence. And so want folks to be, we sort of ask folks to be thinking about that in previous meetings, want to have a conversation about it now, want to first test, are we all in agreement that one of the recommendations will be direct cash payments?
Yes,
Go ahead.
I'll go down the line. Dr. Ross, are you a yes or no?
I will go ahead and say yes.
Okay. Kimberly, are you a yes or no?
yes,
David,
Yes.
William,
Yes.
Delisha?
I'm undecided.
You're undecided. Okay. Um, so David, can you go over this proposal, please?
Before you go over, okay, you're gonna go over the full proposal. Okay, I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, it's broken into 2 slides. Sorry. It's 2 slides because I couldn't
Okay.
get it on one.
Go ahead.
Okay, and do we want to talk first about about calculating, like our scope in terms of calculating, or to think about things in addition to cash payments? What would you like to talk about first?
The cash payment, the payments allocation.
Oh, how we're going to deal with it? Okay. Yeah, so, you know, as a foundation, or at least as an example or a benchmark, the California report is really instructive because I think that they're the commission to date that has done the most to kind of rigorously try to create
David just froze.
Oh, he froze.
oh no.
For a second.
Back?
You are back, but maybe go off video so we can hear you better. So your computer's not pulling video and voice.
Um, uh, says unstable. Okay. Just if you're not understanding, but the California most thinking about estimating harm in a way that allow for precise estimates of what is owed to people who've been impacted, how we can do the kind we've been talking about, thinking about blanket recompense, but then also targeted kinds of payments, as we about with Mill Creek, et cetera. And they basically adopt an actuarial framework. So what they've done is they've gone through each type of harm. So our report, we have 5 areas here. And so there'd be particular harms associated with each area. And what they do really is look at the level of inequity, racialized inequity for each type of harm. And they assign, like people do for insurance using actuarial tables, the value associated with that harm. So if we look at inequalities in arrest rates, for instance, one can assign a value for the loss of freedom per year or per month or whatever the unit of time would be. If we're looking at differences in life expectancy, there's an actuarial value for the loss or the shortening of one's life. And so for every area, they assign these actuarial values. And then that allows them to have precise estimates of the scale of the harm and what should be owed to people who've been impacted. And what we wanted to present as a proposal here is to note that we have done a lot of work over the past year, and I think it's equipped us well to make recommendations around the forms of redress that should be offered, recommendations around eligibility standards and requirements like we've just been talking about, and recommendations around the process that the city should follow to actualize these kinds of measures, not necessarily where the money's coming from, but the process for how people can make claims and all of that. It seems that we're really well positioned to do all of that. But it seems like there's a much greater challenge in terms of the scope of time that we're able to work together, the experience and expertise that we bring to this. It seems more challenging to think that we can actually be the people who are assigning these actuarial values and making very precise dollar amount estimates ourselves. And so as an alternative proposal, one thing that we could have on the table is that we can recommend that if we do continue to vote this way, that direct cash payments are part of our process here. We can recommend the parameters around that as we are now, but that we also recommend that the city convene after we sunset, the city convene another body that's equipped very specifically to make these calculations in a credible way, and to create these estimates for the administering of particular cash payments. So it's shrinking our purview a little bit with the recognition that we might not be ideally positioned in the next month, certainly, to be able to rigorously and credibly make these actuarial calculations that would be required to really think precisely about these cash payments. So that's at least one proposal on the table about what we should be doing now and what we should be proposing that another body be convened to do down the line.
I think that's entirely proper. I think it's very practical. I don't think it is uh, uh, dispensing with our responsibility. I think it's just recognizing it's just a realization of the limitations we have, this body has. And so I think if we're really sincere about moving forward, we have to just acknowledge that and then put the claim in to actually create an organization of thought leaders and individuals who could do just that, David. So I think that is in part, it's kind of related to our ability to make a statement and ensure that there is a process going forward that would address the actual payment systems. So I fully support that.
Thank you, Dr. Cunningham, for that additional context. And I too, from this perspective, I can support cash payment as a consideration as well. Also, I would strongly support us recommending the additional body to continue this work as well. Because I do think that there's another level to go that we are unable to get to, but that needs to continue with this and in determining an amount and what that looks like, and also um, another option other than a cash payment. So while the housing assistance, for example, in Evanston, I feel like that's one example of another way. If there's, I don't know, maybe for education, if there's some type of scholarship with the community college or something, something to think of that could also be beneficial in addition to cash payments within the limitations of what the city can realistically do.
Yeah, I hear that. And I'm taking notes on programs that you are mentioning as other options. And also just like there was someone who testified very early on in the process that really charged us with the proposed, like, you don't want to say shoot for the stars, land on the moon. You don't want to say anything like that, because it's not our job to determine where the city lands. It's the mayor's job to organize her administration, and it's the Board of Aldermen's job to articulate a policy. It's our job to define the harm and set forth recommendations, not with someone in our ear saying what should and shouldn't be, what is feasible and what is not feasible. And so without restraint of working for the city, or and just being the people we are from the fields that we come from, offering that it should be a multitude of things, and that we actually should recommend as much as possible, because the one housing program won't is not adequate redress for what people have lost. One scholarship to a community college and one cash payment isn't either. And so part of the thinking around the this sort of like equation that creates this input, this multi-input solution, is that, if what my mother endured in St. Louis is very different than what I endured. What, someone in Mill Creek Valley is very different than someone who was born in 1989. And so thinking about versus saying, and in some reparations reports, there has just been sort of a blanket amount, 10,000, 25,000, etc. I think San Francisco says something like $1 million per Black family, right? And so it is, those ranges are hard to, that sort of singular amount closes the conversation in a particular way. And so I think this offering, this sort of multivariant approach to it, I think is really appropriate.
Thank you, Kayla. I think that's also quite wise. And I'm glad you mentioned San Francisco, because those amounts have essentially negated any further discussions. They've closed the door for any discussions, because they're so not over the top, but they're so unreasonable, so unlikely, that they end up dismissing the entirety of the report. And so we don't want to fall victim of that, by advocating something that is just so outside of the scope of what a small municipality can do.
Yep. Great. So then if anyone else on this, is everyone like a yes, this is the general direction we should be heading, we'll sharpen it, apply it to St. Louis, get as specific as possible on what should be counted by the next body, and that the role of the next body is singularly focused on determining the amounts, the process to get to an amount, and then the amount by which like folks should receive.
Yes,
Okay.
I agree. I think that's
Yes.
very responsible.
Okay. Amazing. So then, we went through that. We went through the longest slides with the shortest amount of time. Maybe it's because we did a lot of work beforehand before we got here, but I just wanted to note that. And then the other things are, we sort of thought about this in four buckets. One is like, there should be a formal apology, right? Like a on the docket, embedded in city infrastructure, a true articulation of the history of race-based harms in the city of St. Louis, and a sort of formal apology from the city for its role inside of race-based harms. The second thing we've talked about, which is also a part of sort of the larger definition of reparations by I think by Cobra, is sort of memorialization, right? And so like we've seen one of the examples of this is most notably in Mill Creek Valley, with the Pillars of the Valley that was done by Damon Davis, which is at the new at the soccer stadium, the statues, I guess they're statues, that have been built. And with the names of the residents of Mill Creek Valley on them. You've seen sort of memorializations like that, and then sort of smaller, like placard, you know, explanations of what was here, what happened, etc. So there are opportunities to think about recommendations in those two buckets, and then the last two buckets, which are sort of what Delisha was um, articulating, are like programs and policies, and so things like a scholarship program or a home ownership program, etc. And so we just want to open up the conversation for the next 30 from the commission on what else outside of direct payments should, and it doesn't need to be as specific as possible if we don't feel ready for that. Like, you can always email us the report working group about things as you sharpen them, or find examples that you want to include, but want to just open up to see if anyone has ideas around policies, programs, more memorialization, and if folks agree with the recommendation of a formal apology. I'm going to stop sharing screen.
I want to speak to the apology especially. Um, there seems to be, not only in St. Louis, but also in other efforts across the country, the significance of just the acknowledging, of acknowledging what happened is really, really significant. And so I definitely think that an official apology by the city of St. Louis, I don't want to say it should be a given, but we absolutely should recommend that that is a step that is taken, and that should not be difficult to get that done. And then I do the memorialization. I also agree with that if there are markers, especially in those areas where communities existed and they are no longer in existence. So to really have that snippet of history of those areas, I think that too is impactful, because it's simply saying we know you were here in spirit, you're still here. Um, but I think that those are, along with programs, policies, but I really think that those are important to have the acknowledgement of what happened.
Thank you. I think you're talking, Dr. Ross, you on mute.
Okay, so yeah, I agree. I think you think about the statue of Dred Scott in front of the old courthouse. What a great memorialization that is. And as Alicia was saying, you think about the site at the old Prodigo. I mean, that's the what's the center? Um, I'm sorry, I blocked my mind. That's the Geospatial Center in that site. It would be great if the city could work with the Geospatial Center to have some sort of memorialization for Prodigo. It could be a plaque, it could be something of that nature. Again, the memorial at the soccer stadium is just powerful. It's wonderful. And I think something like that at the old Prodigo site would be also great, great statement, powerful statement.
I agree with that 100%. And memorialization in particular seems important because it does document and honor people who've been impacted here. It also seems to have, it seems important to have a publication component too, because obviously there's going to be the region who aren't necessarily on board with the idea of reparations, and the more that there can be a discussion and knowledge of what has occurred along these lines and the kinds of harms that we document in the report, the the better in terms of public education. So I'm certainly a fan of that. I do have a question though, because I think, the Mill Creek commemorative site that currently exists, the Dred Scott one that Dr. Ross just mentions, I mean, these are really powerful, and I think they're straightforward in the sense of what should happen and then seeing it actualized in that way. And I'm wondering about some of the more challenging harm we're back here. So, for instance, pronounced state section report, I mean, what we're seeing is a really pronounced racialized process of fatal police violence. And, so one could think that people, victims, police violence could also merit. Um,
David, you're coming in and out, so we're not getting.
I'm sorry. Okay. This is an email, but I'll try for a second. Can you hear me? Am I still cutting in and out?
Yeah,
Well, to
turn your
continue.
video off. You're just frozen.
Okay. All right. Well, if I still keep cutting out, and then I'll just stop taking up
Sounds
our
great,
time.
man.
Okay. So just saying about more challenging kinds of things that be memorialized, thinking about fatal police violence in St. Louis, as our report does, we also recommend that things like that could be memorialized publicly, where people who are victimized in that way by police violence, there could be a marker or something like that. And I'm just noting how controversial these kinds of, whether it be perceived as anti-police or however it's perceived, that will look like. And so I guess noting the difference between memorialization of events that there's wide consensus around their memorialization, and then other things that are more controversial. I'm not, because I think we should shut controversial ones, but I don't think it's an obvious thing that people usually point to in terms of the commemorative landscape. And so I wanted to at least put it out there for what the scope of memorialization we might propose would be.
Right. I'll capture that in the notes. Thank you, David. Any others?
I'm in agreement with the apology and the memorialization. Um, I think it's a great start to a response, and sometimes silence is a response. So I think doing something, at least those, would be a great forward direction. So
Awesome. I don't think we have any, is there anyone else on the commission who wanted to speak to these recommendations? The next step, just to verify is, we're continuing to assemble the report, and this was really helpful for us to think about both, how we define reparations in this context for the report, and then the start of the recommendations. So we'll go back and start to, edit and add in things that are missing. And then we want to send that draft to the larger commission once it is, assembled. And so if there are no other thoughts about recommendations, I think we heard from everybody except Kim.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for asking.
No problem. So if you do, just like send the email to myself, send it to me, Kayla, you all know my email. And then, we'll be in touch via email about next steps. I don't think we have any non-commission members on the call. But just want to note if there's anyone who wants to give public comment. But I don't think anyone is on the call outside of commission members.
We have two who are,
Okay.
and we have one, we have a hand up.
Okay,
Well,
great.
we had a hand up.
I see that, Trey, can we add Trey to give public comment?
Trey, I think you should be able to unmute.
Yeah, hey, good evening. Um, I didn't have any public comment to really add as of now. I mean, could I comment on some of the earlier debate about the lineage-based argument and who it should be going to or who it shouldn't be and that type of thing?
Sure, but can we ask that you adhere to the 3 minutes? That is what we would typically give in the for the public comment. So yeah, you absolutely can.
Okay. Well, yeah,
Um,
I'll try to be short. I just think that when we talk about um including people who immigrated to the area, I think we have to look at the census data, and then from there we can make a more sound decision about if we should include people um, who are not direct descendants of slavery. Because when you think about um, some of the other uh, some of the other parameters that you guys are commissioned to look at, I forget what were the three elements. I believe it was slavery, and then like segregation.
segregation and race-based harm. Yeah.
I think you have to look at who are those policies specifically targeting. And I think, people who immigrated to the country during that time, they were most likely affluent. And so they weren't in these areas. They were most likely out of the area of harm. And so I just think we have to look at the census data, and then we can start from there. I think that would be smart. That was my comment.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Trey. Um,
We have another person. I don't know. Their hand was raised. I'm gonna give them the opportunity to speak, and then if they unmute, then we'll. Andrea, it looks like. Okay. Well, she has not unmuted, so perhaps she changed her mind.
I'm
Oh,
sorry, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to raise my hand if I did. No, I do not have anything to add.
okay. Thank you.
Can I just raise a quick issue related to trade point
mhm.
about the state? I'm going to stop my video again to hopefully not freeze up. Just one thing to have on the table, it seems like, is the degree to which where we put the onus on documentation. So when Trey mentioned census data, that seems really important. And I'm noting that the Darity group right now seems to be advocating for putting the onus on the people who are making claims. So they would come to whatever the official body is, and they would have they make a lineage-based argument. So they would have to show proof of lineage, and they have a whole kind of methodology with genealogy that people can work through to develop that proof. But there's another approach, though, that would really put the onus on an official body to do that. And I could imagine, like personally, I think, especially if we're already recommending that the city of St. Louis appoint a more permanent body that would do calculations and things, to my mind, it doesn't seem unreasonable that that body or a parallel body could also have access to a full range of census data and be able to help people to document, how long their family would have lived here, when they moved, when they left. And so just to note, it seems important to at least recommend either that the city has this responsibility to help people document this, or that we're putting it on the people who are who are making the claims, because it just seems different in terms of what the process will look like, and it seems like something we should be able to weigh in on one way or the other.
Yeah, David, I feel that the onus should be on the person to make their claim. but that person should have some official resources that you're kind of alluding to, and they should have someone who can guide them to those resources. But I don't think it's the responsibility. It should be the responsibility. It should not be the responsibility of the city to actually state that unequivocally. We will be here to guide anyone who wants to make a claim. I think that really has to be the purview of that individual.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think to Trey's point, like, we don't know the scale of the population that we are talking about, right? So I don't know if we're talking about 2,000 people or 20,000 people in St. Louis's history and time. Different geographies have different populations of folks who have immigrated from other parts of the diaspora, and so I take that into account and think that that is a relevant point, and also, so I appreciate that.
I
Um,
I agree as well. I might say maybe to attenuate that then is that we try to charge the city with gathering. I mean, what really is needed to establish residency are census data is useful, but also city directories, which were published every year going back to the 19th century, and they're very detailed in terms of who lived at every address in the city, basically. And so one could establish when someone
lived in the place you
um,
froze again, David.
I'm sorry, just to know you would be able to make those to people, like a full run of city directory and census that people could on. Because I just worry that there are sets of people who just don't have access to that kind of thing, and it creates a really barrier to be able to document, when their family would have lived and when their family would have left.
Yeah, so I agree. The city can develop a repository of such information, and then individuals will be able to access that. And if necessary, they can call and ask for assistance. But I think that's true to your point of actually making the information available, and for those who feel inclined, they can access that, and or else find someone who can assist them in accessing that information. That I
Yeah.
agree with.
Yeah. And this is one of the consequences of many systems at play, right? The inability to have access to personal documents, hospitals closing, schools closing, doctors' offices not, so there are natural, or not natural, there are sort of created moments where folks don't have access to, or don't know where to go to find certain documents, et cetera. But definitely taken into account. And and the report working group again is going to take this conversation, which I think has been very productive and very meaningful, in our work as we prepare to send you all a clean draft of the report in its entirety. And so Delisha will be in touch about next steps as far as meetings go. And we'll be in touch via email with any questions that we have in the interim. Thank you all for
Can I,
spending.
before we wrap, Kayla, can I just ask? I heard from two commissioners around my question of availability, a preference for the September date, and we really need to get that firmed up. So right now I am leaning toward uh, September 24th, Tuesday, September 24th for that final meeting. If that works for everybody on this call, the commissioners on this call, this is a quorum. We can lock that in.
I would like to, if you could give us like the report working group a couple days, because we have been thinking about all of September to get to the completed report. And so just if we can like offline that, I think that would be great.
Okay.
Because we'll
Okay.
just be down to the wire about days. And so we might need the
Well, the
extra day.
24th is the end of the month. So we're wrapped, like that's it. And we do not have more time.
Right, but the
So
30th is the end of the month. And so the Monday, September 30th might be the day that we need to
So do you want to lock that in? We just need to start locking in location too.
I
So
would
if the
propose
30th,
over the 21st, the 24th, yeah.
I would be in favor of the 30th. I would support that.
I'm in favor of either date.
I can do either date as well, but I hear Kayla, having the extra 6 days would be helpful.
so we can, if the 30th works for everybody here, we can lock that in now as our final meeting. And we will share location for that, but we at least have the date.
Okay, and then the other thing is there a planning meeting in September that we want to schedule as well?
So that is a question. Um, we don't currently have one scheduled, but if we want to stay with the Wednesday that we do typically meet for planning, I can put an invite together for that. The second, the third Wednesday.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be good, just so
Okay.
Yeah.
that gives us the deadline to get the draft to you all, and get any last minute feedback for the final.
Yeah, and I won't be available that week, but you all carry on.
Hey, I
Okay,
think
so
Wednesday the 18th would work fine.
okay, so if that sounds like what works for the majority. So I will, for the planning meeting, I'll send that invite out for 9/18, and for the final commission meeting, September 30th.
Great.
Okay,
Right.
thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a really great rest of your evening. Thanks for leaning into this.
Can
We
you
are almost
officially,
there.
don't forget to officially wrap the meeting.
Yes. Can we take it? Can we take a motion to close the
I
meeting?
move to adjourn the meeting.
Second,
Second. Oh, okay,
All right.
Kimberly.
Thanks you
Thank
all.
you all.
Bye.
thank you.